My father blocked the entrance to my own brother's engagement party, shoving a crumpled $100 bill against my chest. He told me I was too much of an embarrassment to be seen by my future sister-in-law's wealthy family. He demanded I take the money and go eat at a diner down the street so I would not ruin the aesthetic of their perfect high society evening. When he saw me just a few days later in a corporate penthouse, he asked if I was applying for a janitorial job. He nearly choked when his future daughter-in-law looked at him in horror and said, "No, that is my boss." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace. The crisp autumn air of Atlanta bit at my bare shoulders as I stood at the bottom of the grand marble steps of the Oak Ridge Country Club. I had worn a simple but elegant emerald green silk dress, choosing to dress understated so as not to draw attention away from my brother Jamal on his big night. But as I reached for the brass handle of the heavy oak doors, my father Calvin stepped out from the shadows of the portico. His large frame entirely blocked my path. He wore a tailored tuxedo that I knew for a fact he had rented, but he carried himself with the inflated posture of a man who owned the entire estate. He looked me up and down, his eyes narrowing with a familiar mixture of disdain and panic. "You are not going in there, Simone," he hissed, grabbing my upper arm with a grip tight enough to bruise. His voice was kept low, a harsh whisper, designed to avoid the attention of the valet, parking the endless stream of luxury vehicles nearby. I looked down at his hand, and then back up to his face, keeping my expression completely neutral. "Let go of my arm, Dad," I replied, my voice steady. "I am here to celebrate Jamal. I was invited." "You were sent a courtesy invitation because your mother begged for it," he snapped, dropping my arm but taking a step forward to physically wedge himself between me and the glass doors. "But you are not coming inside. Chloe's parents are partners at a massive corporate law firm. They are flying in from Boston. Half the guests in there are senior executives and wealthy socialites. Look at you. You do not fit the aesthetic of this family anymore. You are going to embarrass your brother." I stared at the man who was supposed to protect me. For 35 years I had been the scapegoat, the dark cloud in his perfect suburban fantasy. He reached into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out a single crumpled $100 bill. He shoved it forcefully against my chest, forcing me to take it or let it fall to the cold stone ground. "Take this and go get yourself some dinner. Somewhere else," he ordered, his eyes darting nervously toward the glowing windows of the club, as if terrified someone might look out and see him associating with his own daughter. "Go to that diner down the street. Just stay out of sight until the party is over. Jamal cannot afford to have his college dropout sister talking about her little side hustles to people who actually matter." The sheer audacity of his words hung in the cold air. College dropout, side hustles. My father was still living in a narrative he had constructed 15 years ago when I left the state university to start my first business. He had no idea that my little side hustle was now Apex Acquisitions, a highly successful corporate consulting and wealth management firm. He had no idea because he never bothered to ask. In his eyes, Jamal was the golden child, the successful businessman, the one destined for greatness, despite the fact that Jamal was drowning in debt and living a complete lie. I looked at the $100 bill in my hand. It was creased and worn, likely withdrawn from an automated teller machine that very afternoon, from an account I knew was heavily overdrawn. A bitter laugh almost escaped my lips. My father was taking out loans to pay for a facade of generational wealth, while literally paying me to stay away so his house of cards would not collapse in front of his new wealthy white in-laws. "Are you seriously paying me to leave my own brother's engagement party?" I asked, holding the bill between two manicured fingers. "I am protecting my son's future," Calvin growled, leaning in closer. His breath smelled of expensive scotch and cheap desperation. "You have always been jealous of him, Simone. Ever since you were kids, you could never just let him shine. Tonight is about him. It is about aligning our family with the right kind of people, people with actual pedigree, not people who hustle on the streets trying to make a quick buck." The irony was almost suffocating. The pedigree he was so desperately trying to impress was an illusion he could not afford. The generational wealth he bragged about to anyone who would listen was a complete fabrication built on a second mortgage he took out on the family home, a mortgage he was currently defaulting on. But I did not say any of that. I did not yell. I did not cry. I had stopped crying over my father's rejection when I was a teenager. The valet stand to my left was bustling with activity. Young men in uniform rushed to open the doors of imported sedans and sleek sports cars. I had parked my chauffeured luxury sedan around the corner specifically to avoid making a grand entrance. I wanted tonight to be about Jamal. Despite everything, despite the years of obvious favoritism and the endless comparisons, I still carried a shred of hope that we could just be a family for one evening. That hope evaporated the moment my father shoved that money at me. He stood there smoothing his lapels, trying to regain his composure after his outburst. His desperation to be accepted by the upper echelons of society was a sickness that had infected our family for decades. Growing up, we were not rich. We were middle class at best, living in a modest brick house in a decent neighborhood. But my father acted as though we were royalty who had simply been temporarily displaced. He bought luxury cars on terrible financing plans and wore designer suits he could barely afford, all to project an image of undeniable success. Jamal absorbed this lesson perfectly and became a master of the facade. "You need to leave before your mother comes out here," Calvin said, his voice dropping an octave as a wealthy older couple walked past us up the stairs. He offered them a tight, polite smile, nodding respectfully before turning his glare back to me. "She is inside entertaining Chloe's parents. If she sees you, it will just cause a scene, and her blood pressure is already high from the stress of planning this." The manipulation was classic Calvin, using my mother's health as a weapon to force my compliance. My mother Brenda was the ultimate enabler. She went along with whatever my father said to keep the peace, even if it meant throwing her own daughter to the wolves. I took a deep breath, letting the chilly night air fill my lungs. I looked at the man who shared my blood, but had never truly known my heart. Beneath the rented tuxedo and the bluster, he was a man drowning in his own lies. The weight of his hidden debt was etched into the deep lines around his eyes and mouth. "I am leaving," I said softly. "Not because you are forcing me to. Not because I am embarrassed of who I am. I am leaving because I finally realize that there is nothing inside that building for me." I reached out and gently tucked the $100 bill back into the breast pocket of his jacket. He flinched, as if my touch burned him. "You are going to need every penny of that, soon, Dad." I whispered, my voice devoid of malice, just cold, hard truth. "The bill is coming due." I turned on my heel and began the walk down the sweeping marble staircase. Each step felt like a heavy chain snapping. For years, I had desperately craved a seat at their table. I had wanted my father to look at me with the same pride he reserved for my brother. But standing on those steps, feeling the rejection wash over me one final time, I realized the truth. Their table was built on rotting wood, and I was busy building an empire. I had barely made it to the bottom of the grand staircase when the heavy oak doors groaned open again behind me. Warm golden light spilled out onto the marble, followed by the sharp rhythmic sound of expensive leather shoes hitting the stone. "Simone, wait a second," Jamal called out. I stopped and slowly turned around. My younger brother stood at the top of the stairs, looking every inch the prince my parents had raised him to be. He was 30 years old, but still carried the arrogant smirk of a teenager who knew he could get away with anything. He shot his cuffs, casually adjusting a thick gold Rolex on his wrist. I recognized that watch immediately. It was a graduation gift from our father, purchased with a high-interest credit card that I was almost certain had gone to collections months ago. But to anyone else walking past, he looked like young black excellence personified. He descended a few steps, stopping just above me so he could literally look down at me. He glanced nervously back at the glass doors to make sure his precious future in-laws had not followed him out. Look, I am sorry Dad was so harsh, Jamal said, though his tone held zero actual apology. He ran a hand over his perfectly faded haircut. But you have to understand the situation here, Simone. Chloe's parents are senior partners at a massive corporate law firm in Boston. They mingle with senators and chief executive officers. They belong to the kinds of country clubs we used to only drive past. I cannot have my college dropout sister showing up in a plain dress, talking about her little hustles and embarrassing me tonight in front of people who actually matter. The sheer audacity of his words felt like a physical blow, even though I should have expected it. Jamal had always been a master at dressing up his insults as practical observations, little hustles. That was what he called the grueling 80-hour work weeks I spent building Apex acquisitions from the ground up while he was failing out of his first master's degree program. While he was begging our father to pay off his luxury car lease, I was securing millions in corporate buyouts. But in his mind, because I did not follow the traditional path to a fancy degree, I was forever beneath him. I looked at my brother taking in his custom-tailored suit and the condescending tilt of his chin. "You think my presence is going to embarrass you, Jamal?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "Not the fact that you are paying for this entire wedding on credit. Not the fact that your so-called trust fund is just Dad draining the equity from the house we grew up in." His jaw tightened, and a flash of genuine panic crossed his eyes. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to an angry hiss. "Keep your voice down. You do not know what you are talking about. I am securing my future. Chloe comes from real generational wealth, Simone. This is my shot to elevate this family to a level you could never reach with your little consulting gigs. Do not ruin this for me just because you are bitter and alone." Before I could tell him that my little consulting gig had just finalized a corporate merger that would make me his future wife's ultimate boss, the heavy doors opened a third time. My mother, Brenda, rushed out, clutching a beaded evening bag to her chest. She looked frantic, her eyes darting between Jamal and me. "Simone, what on earth are you doing?" she demanded, her voice trembling with misplaced outrage. She rushed down the steps, her heels clicking frantically. "Why do you always have to ruin your brother's big moments?" I stared at her, completely bewildered. Ruin his moment. Mom, I literally just got here and Dad physically blocked me from entering the building. I was walking away to my car. Brenda waved her hand dismissively, completely ignoring my explanation. "Chloe's mother was just asking where Jamal went. We cannot leave them alone at the table for too long. They will think we have no manners." She turned to Jamal, placing a gentle, reassuring hand on his arm, completely shifting her demeanor from hostile to coddling. "Go back inside, baby. Let me handle your sister. Do not let her stress you out tonight." Jamal shot me a triumphant look, a silent confirmation that he had won yet again. He turned and jogged back up the stairs, disappearing into the warm light of the country club, without another word to me. My mother let out a heavy sigh, finally looking at me. She adjusted her silk shawl, avoiding direct eye contact. "Simone, why do you always have to provoke him?" she asked, sounding exhausted. "You know how much pressure he is under to impress Chloe's family. Why could you not just stay home and send a nice gift?" "I am your daughter, Mom," I said, my voice cracking just a fraction before I reinforced it with steel. "I am his sister, and I was invited to this dinner. You called me yourself, begging me to come so we could look like a united front. I only did that because I thought you would have the sense to dress the part and act like you belong," Brenda snapped defensively, finally meeting my gaze. "But you always have to bring this defensive energy. You are making your father anxious. He just wants tonight to be perfect. Is it really so much to ask for you to take a back seat for one evening and let Jamal have his time in the sun?" "He has been in the sun his entire life, Mom," I replied, staring back at her. "And you and Dad are burning the whole house down just to keep him warm. You are co-signing his lies. Chloe's family thinks they are marrying into wealth, but they are marrying into a financial sinkhole." Brenda gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. "How dare you speak about our finances? You know nothing about what it takes to maintain our position in the community. Your father has a plan. Jamal has a plan. I am sure they do, I said, shaking my head slowly. I took a step back, putting literal distance between us. The urge to argue the desperate need to make her see my worth suddenly vanished, leaving nothing but a cold, hollow clarity. I looked at my mother, seeing her for exactly what she was, a woman who would rather sacrifice her daughter than face the reality of her son's failures. I will not ruin his night, Mom, I said softly, my voice echoing slightly in the damp air. I will not be in your way anymore. But when that brilliant plan of yours collapses, do not come looking for my little hustles to bail you out. I turned my back on her before she could formulate another excuse. I did not wait to hear her response. I just kept walking toward the shadows where my driver was waiting. The crunch of gravel beneath my heels felt like a steady heartbeat as I moved further away from the glowing entrance of the Oak Ridge Country Club. I did not look back. I knew my mother was likely still standing there clutching her beaded bag, trying to figure out how to spin my departure to Chloe's wealthy parents. For the first time in my life, I did not care what narrative they spun about me. The heavy knot of anxiety that usually sat in my chest during family gatherings was completely gone. In its place was a sharp, cold clarity. As I reached the edge of the sprawling driveway, I stopped for a moment in front of the massive stone sign that bore the country club's crest. The gold lettering gleamed under the landscape lighting, proudly announcing a place of exclusivity and old money. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I opened the camera and snapped a quick photo of the sign. I did not take the picture out of resentment. I took it as a receipt. I wanted to remember exactly where my father stood when he chose his son's lie over his daughter's truth. I wanted a permanent record of the exact moment I finally stopped trying to earn a seat at their table. A few yards down the road, past the line of valet-parked luxury vehicles, my black Maybach sat idling quietly in the shadows. My driver stepped out immediately as he saw me approach, opening the heavy rear door with a respectful nod. He did not ask why I was returning so soon. He was a professional who had driven me to enough board meetings and high-stakes negotiations to know when to speak and when to remain silent. I slid into the spacious back seat, and the door closed with a solid, reassuring thud, instantly muting the sounds of the crisp autumn night. The interior of the car smelled of rich leather and quiet success. It was a stark contrast to the rented tuxedo and the desperate facade my father was currently projecting just a few hundred yards away. I leaned back into the plush seat, letting the tension slowly drain from my shoulders. There were no tears. I had shed all my tears for this family in the cramped back seat of a beat-up Honda Civic a decade ago. Tonight, there was only the quiet satisfaction of a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she was worth. My driver merged the heavy car smoothly onto the main road, leaving the country club and my family's delusions behind us. The partition between the front and back seats was already raised, giving me complete privacy. I stared out the tinted window, watching the streetlights blur past. My phone vibrated against the leather seat, breaking the silence of the cabin. The bright screen illuminated the dark space, displaying the name of my chief operating officer, Renee. It was nearly 9 o'clock on a Saturday night, but in the world of high-level corporate acquisitions, time was irrelevant. If Renee was calling me now, it meant the deal we had been relentlessly pursuing for the last 6 months was finally crossing the finish line. I swiped the screen to answer, bringing the phone to my ear. "Tell me it is done," I said, my voice steady and commanding, completely shifting from the rejected daughter to the chief executive officer. "The ink is dry," Simone Renee replied, her voice crackling with excitement over the secure line. "The board of directors at Sterling Media Group officially signed off on the buyout 20 minutes ago. The wire transfers have cleared. Apex Acquisitions now owns 100% of their assets, their client roster, and their subsidiaries. We are officially the parent company." A slow, deliberate smile spread across my face. "Excellent work, Renee," I said, feeling a surge of genuine accomplishment. "Have the legal team finalize the employee transition documents by Monday morning." I want a full audit of their senior staff and a complete list of their active accounts on my desk before I get into the office. We are going to trim the fat and restructure their management immediately. Consider it done, Renee said. Oh, and Simone. There is one more thing. I was reviewing the employee roster for their downtown branch just to get a head start on the restructuring. You might find this interesting. The junior executive who spearheaded that marketing campaign we noticed last quarter is on the list. Her name is Chloe Davenport. Does that name ring a bell? The name echoed in the quiet space of the car. Chloe Davenport, Jamal's fiancée, the woman from the high society Boston family, the woman my father was currently bankrupting himself to impress. My brother was building his entire fake empire on the premise of marrying into Chloe's wealthy family. He thought he was securing his future by aligning himself with her pedigree. He had banished me from his engagement party because he believed my mere presence would jeopardize his golden ticket. What he did not know, what none of them knew, was that the boutique marketing firm Chloe worked for, the firm that gave her that fancy junior executive title, had just been swallowed whole by my company. Yes, Renee, I replied, my voice dropping to a smooth, calculated whisper. That name rings a very loud bell. Ensure her file is at the very top of the stack on Monday morning. I want to personally review her performance metrics. Understood, Renee said clearly, sensing the shift in my tone, but professional enough not to ask questions. Have a good night, Simone. I ended the call and let the phone drop into my lap. I looked out the window as the city skyline came into view, glittering against the dark sky. The universe had a fascinating way of balancing the scales. Less than an hour ago, my father had shoved $100 bill at me, treating me like a peasant, begging for scraps outside a palace. He had banished me to protect my brother's illusion of power. But as the Maybach glided smoothly onto the highway heading toward my penthouse downtown, the reality of the situation settled over me like a heavy velvet cloak. Jamal was not marrying into power. He was marrying an employee of Apex Acquisitions. He was marrying into my payroll. The house of cards my father had spent his entire life building was not just fragile. It was already resting in the palm of my hand. And all I had to do was decide when to blow it down. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the headrest. Monday morning was going to be very interesting. The crisp efficiency of Monday morning was exactly what I needed to wash away the lingering toxicity of the weekend. The doors of my private elevator opened directly into the penthouse suite of the Apex Acquisitions headquarters. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed view of the Atlanta skyline, a sprawling kingdom of glass and steel that I had conquered while my father was busy pretending to be a king in the suburbs. My heels clicked against the polished mahogany floor as I walked past the reception desk where my executive assistant already had my morning espresso waiting. I stepped into my office and took my seat behind the massive marble desk. The space was completely silent, insulated from the chaos of the city below. Exactly at 8 o'clock, my chief operating officer, Renee, walked through the double doors holding a thick, leather-bound portfolio. She looked perfectly put together, her sharp eyes ready for the massive restructuring we were about to undertake. "Good morning," Simone, Renee said, setting the portfolio directly in the center of my desk. "Here is the complete employee audit for Sterling Media Group." As requested, I placed the file for the downtown branch right on top. And yes, the junior executive we discussed is right there. "Thank you, Renee," I replied, picking up my espresso. "Let us see exactly what we bought." I opened the portfolio and flipped past the executive summaries, going straight to the personnel files. It only took a few seconds to find her. Chloe Davenport. There was her corporate headshot staring back at me. She looked exactly like the kind of woman my father would desperately try to impress. Blonde hair perfectly styled, a bright, eager smile, and an aura of polished upper-middle-class comfort. I scanned her performance metrics, her quarterly reviews, and finally her compensation package. She was doing exceptionally well for a 28-year-old. Her base salary was solid, and her bonuses were respectable. She was ambitious and capable. But as I looked at the numbers, a glaring discrepancy began to form in my mind. Chloe made good money, but she did not make the kind of money required to fund the lavish lifestyle my brother was currently parading around town. She certainly did not make enough to single-handedly pay for a wedding that I knew for a fact was creeping past the $100,000 mark, which meant the financial burden of this extravagant union was supposedly falling on Jamal. I leaned back in my chair, tapping my manicured nail against the edge of the desk. Jamal had not held a steady, high-paying job since he dropped out of his master's program. He bounced from one vague entrepreneurial venture to another, always relying on my father to provide the seed money. He drove a luxury sports car, wore designer suits, and rented exclusive sections at high-end clubs on the weekends. My father had always bragged to anyone who would listen that Jamal was managing a highly successful family trust. But I knew the truth about our family. There was no generational wealth. My grandfather had been a hardworking man who left a modest inheritance specifically earmarked for my education. Money that my father had quietly drained to buy Jamal's first car. The house we grew up in was paid off years ago, but my father had never made the kind of investments required to sustain the lifestyle Jamal was currently faking. If Chloe believed she was marrying into money, she was being severely misled. And if Jamal was paying for country club engagement parties and flawless diamond rings, I needed to know exactly whose money he was spending. "Renee," I said, keeping my eyes locked on Chloe's file, "get Derek from corporate intelligence on the line. Have him come up to my office immediately." Right away, Renee nodded, stepping out of the room. 5 minutes later, Derek walked in. He was a former forensic accountant who now ran the investigative arm of Apex Acquisitions. He was the man I used when I needed to know the absolute truth about a company before I bought it. Today, I needed him to look into something much more personal. "Good morning, boss," Derek said, taking a seat across from me. "Who are we looking into today? A rival firm or a difficult board member?" "Neither," I replied, closing Chloe's file and pushing it to the side. "I need you to run a deep dive background check on a private citizen. I want a complete financial forensic workup. Bank accounts, credit lines, outstanding loans, tax liens, everything. I want to know every single dollar coming in and going out." Derek pulled a slim tablet from his jacket. "Give me the name." "Jamal Calvin." "Thomas," I said, watching his fingers fly across the screen. "And while you are at it, run the exact same check on my father. Calvin. Richard Thomas." Derek paused, looking up at me with a raised eyebrow. "Family. That is usually messy. You want the standard sweep or the invasive corporate-level dig?" "I want you to turn their financial lives inside out, Derek," I said, my voice dropping to a serious octave. "They are projecting a very expensive image to some very important people right now. I need to know the reality behind the curtain. Check public records, property deeds, secondary mortgages, and debt collection registries. Leave absolutely no stone unturned." "Consider it done," Derek said, standing up. "Give me an hour to access the banking networks and pull the credit bureau data. I will bring the raw numbers straight to you." As Derek left the office, I turned my chair to face the floor-to-ceiling window. The morning sun was reflecting off the glass towers around me. I had spent years meticulously building my wealth, ensuring that every dollar was accounted for and every investment was sound. I had built a fortress of financial security because I knew I could never rely on the people who were supposed to protect me. My father had spent his entire life obsessing over how things looked rather than how they actually were. He had raised my brother to do the exact same thing. They believed that if they just acted rich enough, the world would eventually hand them the keys to the kingdom. But the world did not work that way. The world demanded receipts. I picked up my espresso and took a slow sip, letting the bitter warmth settle in my chest. Jamal was planning the wedding of the century, acting like a prince bringing his bride into a royal family. Chloe was walking blindly into a marriage, believing her future husband was a financial equal. My father was physically barring me from entering a country club to protect a carefully constructed lie. But lies always leave a paper trail. And I had just unleashed the best forensic investigator in the city to follow it. The anxiety that had plagued me all weekend was entirely replaced by a cold, calculating anticipation. I was no longer the discarded daughter crying in the driveway. I was the chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar firm, and I was about to audit my own family. I just had to wait for Derek to bring me the balance sheet. 58 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of my office swung open. Derek walked in holding a sleek silver flash drive and a single manila folder. He did not look smug. He looked genuinely disturbed, which was saying something for a man who spent his life untangling corporate embezzlement. "I told you an hour," Derek said, sliding the folder across my marble desk. "But honestly, Simone, I only needed 20 minutes to find the bottom of this hole. They are not hiding it well. They are just praying nobody ever looks." I picked up the folder. The cardboard felt heavy in my hands. "Walk me through it," I said, opening the cover. "Let us start with your brother," Derek said, taking the leather chair opposite my desk. He steepled his fingers, leaning forward. "Jamal Thomas is a ghost. Financially speaking, I mean. He produces absolutely zero sustainable income. He has not received a legitimate wage statement in 3 years. That consulting business he claims to run has filed for tax extensions every year and shows zero actual revenue." I flipped to the first page, scanning the highlighted figures. "Then, how is he paying for the Rolex, the cars, and the country club memberships?" I asked. "Debt," Derek stated flatly. "A staggering amount of high-interest unsecured consumer debt. He has maxed out 7 different premium credit cards. He took out 3 separate personal loans from predatory online lenders just in the last 8 months. The auto loan on his sports car is 90 days past due. If you add it all up, your brother is carrying over $200,000 in toxic debt. He is paying the minimums on one card by taking cash advances from another. It is a textbook shell game." I stared at the numbers printed in stark black ink. $200,000. Jamal was walking around Atlanta, acting like a venture capitalist, but his entire net worth was a negative $250,000. He had stood on the steps of that country club, telling me I did not fit the aesthetic of his wealthy future-in-laws while he was dodging collection calls. "And the trust fund?" I asked, looking up at Derek. "The one he is supposedly using to pay for this $100,000 wedding to Chloe." Derek let out a dry, humorless laugh. "There is no trust fund, Simone. I checked every domestic and international registry. I pulled the estate records from your late grandfather. The only trust that ever existed was a small educational fund set up in your name." I felt a cold, familiar knot tighten in my stomach. "I know about that fund," I said quietly. "My father emptied it years ago." "Exactly," Derek nodded. "So without a trust, where is the money for this lavish wedding coming from? That brings us to file number 2. Your father." I turned the page. The next document was a property deed and a lending agreement. It was the deed to the brick house I grew up in. The house my grandfather had proudly paid off completely before he died, passing it down to my father free and clear. It was supposed to be our generational anchor. Calvin Thomas took out a massive second mortgage on the family home 10 months ago. Derek explained, pointing to the circled figure on the page. He leveraged 90% of the home's current market value. The bank gave him a lump sum of $400,000. I followed the columns of numbers tracing the flow of money, and he gave it to Jamal. I concluded, my voice barely above a whisper. Derek nodded again. He wired $50,000 directly into Jamal's checking account the very next day. Over the last few months, there have been constant transfers from your father's accounts to vendors, caterers, florists, event planners, and the Oak Ridge Country Club. Your father is single-handedly financing his son's fake millionaire lifestyle using the equity of the only real asset your family has left. The sheer reckless stupidity of it took my breath away. My father was so desperate to align himself with Chloe's high society parents that he had literally mortgaged his own future. He was burning down his own house to keep Jamal's illusion warm. "But here is the real tragedy," Simone, Derek said, leaning closer. "Your father is a retired city employee living on a fixed pension. He does not have the monthly cash flow to service a $400,000 loan at current interest rates. He has missed the last 3 payments. The bank has already issued the initial notices of default. If he does not come up with $40,000 in arrears by the end of the month, that house goes into foreclosure. They will be out on the street. The silence in the penthouse was absolute. The city outside my window continued its frantic pace, completely oblivious to the financial crater my family had just dug for themselves. For a moment, I just sat there processing the magnitude of their betrayal. My father had physically blocked me from entering a party, treating me like dirty laundry, while his own financial house was actively burning to the ground. He had the nerve to look down on me for starting a business from scratch, while he was secretly destroying the one thing of value our ancestors had built. They hated me because I did not play their game. I had chosen to live in reality, while they chose to live in a very expensive fantasy. And now the bill was coming due. Simone Derrick asked, softly breaking the silence. "What do you want me to do with this? I can bury it. Or I can send it to your legal team if you want to intervene and save the property." "Save it?" I asked, looking up at him. A slow, cold realization was beginning to form in the back of my mind. Why would I save a man who just offered me $100 to disappear? I looked back down at the lending agreement. The name of the bank holding my father's mortgage was listed clearly at the top of the page. It was a mid-sized regional bank that Apex Acquisitions actually had significant leverage over. We had helped them avoid a hostile takeover 2 years ago, and their board of directors owed me a very large favor. "Derek," I said, closing the manila folder and resting my hands flat on top of it. "I do not want to intervene. I want to participate." Derek raised an eyebrow, a slow smile spreading across his face. "What are you thinking?" "I want you to contact our primary legal counsel." I instructed, my tone shifting from shocked daughter to calculating chief executive. "Have them reach out to this regional bank immediately. I want Apex Acquisitions to purchase the debt portfolio that includes my father's mortgage. I want us to buy the loan." "You want to own your father's debt?" Derek asked, clarifying the directive. "I want to own the deed to that house," I corrected him. "If my father defaults, I do not want some faceless bank evicting him. I want to be the one holding the paperwork." They want to play games with generational wealth. It is time they learned what real wealth actually looks like. "Get it done, Derek. Consider it done, boss," he said, standing up and giving me a respectful nod before walking out of the office. I was left alone with the folder. The game had completely changed. My family thought they had successfully pushed me out of their perfect picture. They had no idea I was about to buy the frame. I turned my chair back to the window, watching the city below, ready for whatever move my father tried to make next. Just as the heavy oak door clicked shut behind Derek, my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently against the polished marble of my desk. The bright screen illuminated the quiet space, flashing with a new message notification. The sender was Calvin. I picked up the device and unlocked the screen. What I found was not a brief message, but a massive wall of text, a rambling paragraph dripping with the kind of condescending venom my father usually reserved for moments when his absolute authority felt threatened. "Your behavior last night was an absolute disgrace," he wrote. "Loitering outside that club like some kind of beggar trying to peek into a world where you do not belong. You completely stressed your brother out on the most important night of his life. Chloe's parents were asking questions about the strange woman standing in the driveway, and we had to make up excuses for you. You are selfish, Simone. You have always been selfish. The least you can do to make up for this humiliating stunt is wire your brother $500 for a wedding gift so he and Chloe can enjoy a nice dinner on their honeymoon. Send it to his account by the end of the day, and do not contact him until you are ready to formally apologize." I read the message twice. I did not feel the familiar sting of rejection that used to paralyze me in my 20s. I did not feel the urge to type out a frantic defense or explain that I was literally walking to my chauffeured car. Instead, I felt a cold, sharp burst of dark amusement. $500. The man was over $400,000 in debt. He was exactly 90 days past due on a second mortgage that was about to trigger a foreclosure on our family home. His golden child of a son was carrying $250,000 in toxic credit card balances. Their entire financial reality was currently on life support. Yet here my father was trying to bully me into sending him $500 so they could keep the charade going for just one more week. It was not about the gift, it was about control. It was about making sure I still knew my place as the peasant paying tribute to the king and his prince. He probably needed that exact amount just to cover a bounced check for the wedding florist. I did not reply to the message. I did not type a single word. I simply took a screenshot of his demands, archived the conversation, and placed my phone face down on the desk. I reached over to the sleek intercom system and pressed the button for my executive assistant. "Get Harrison up here immediately," I instructed. "Tell him to drop whatever he is reviewing and bring his tablet." Less than 3 minutes later, Harrison, my lead corporate attorney, strode into my office. Harrison was a brilliant legal strategist, a man who moved through the corporate world with the precision of a surgeon. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit and carried an aura of absolute competence. I paid him an exorbitant salary to make my most complicated acquisitions disappear into a maze of ironclad paperwork. Today, I needed him to execute a much more personal transaction. "Have a seat, Harrison," I said, sliding the manila folder Derek had just given me across the desk. "I need Apex Acquisitions to make a very specific purchase by the end of the week." Harrison sat down and opened the folder. He scanned the lending agreement and the property deed, his eyes quickly digesting the financial data. First Piedmont Alliance, he noted, recognizing the name of the regional bank holding my father's mortgage. "This is a residential distressed asset. We usually deal in commercial buyouts, Simone. Why are we looking at a single defaulted home loan in the suburbs?" "Because I want to own it," I replied, leaning back in my chair and steepling my fingers. First Piedmont is currently holding a significant amount of bad residential paper on their books. They are desperate to offload those toxic assets before their quarterly earnings report. I want you to reach out to their asset management division today. Tell them Apex Acquisitions is willing to buy a bulk portfolio of their distressed debt for pennies on the dollar. But make sure this specific loan, this exact property, is buried inside that portfolio. Harrison looked at the address on the deed, and then looked up at me. He did not ask personal questions. He was far too professional for that. But I could see the gears turning in his head as he calculated the strategy. "We can easily acquire a tranche of their bad debt," he said, tapping his pen against the folder. "They will be thrilled to get it off their balance sheet. But if we purchase the loan, we purchase the rights and the current status of the loan. This file says the borrower is already 90 days delinquent. The initial notices of default have already been mailed." "Exactly?" I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, calculated hum. "I want the assignment of the mortgage expedited and recorded immediately. I want Apex Acquisitions listed as the sole lien holder of that property by Friday afternoon. And Harrison, once the ink is dry and the deed is transferred to our holding company, I want you to waive the standard grace period." Harrison raised an eyebrow, a slow smile forming on his face. "You want to proceed straight to the final notice." "I want to proceed straight to the endgame," I corrected him. "The borrower has already violated the terms of the original lending agreement. They have exhausted their warnings. The moment we own that debt, we become the bank. And this bank does not offer extensions to people who fund fake millionaire lifestyles with money they do not have. Prepare the paperwork for a full acceleration of the loan. When I give the signal, I want the entire remaining balance demanded in full." "Consider it done," Simone, Harrison said, closing the folder and standing up. "I will have the acquisition team draft the offer to First Piedmont within the hour. They will not look too closely at the individual addresses if we bundle it with enough volume. You will be the legal owner of this debt in a matter of days." As Harrison left the office, I turned my chair back toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling city. The gears were now officially in motion. My father thought he was a master manipulator, controlling the narrative of our family with his rented tuxedos and his arrogant text messages. He had spent his entire life trying to keep me out of his perfect picture. He was so busy guarding the front door of his country club that he had not noticed I just bought the ground he was standing on. I picked my phone back up and navigated to my banking application. I did not initiate a wire transfer for $500. Instead, I went into my settings and completely blocked my father's phone number. I blocked Jamal's number as well. Let them wait for the money. Let my father check his bank account every single hour, hoping to see my supposed apology hit his available balance. Let him sweat as the caterers demanded their deposits and the credit card companies started calling his phone non-stop. By the time he realized I was not playing his game anymore, it would be entirely too late. Tomorrow was going to be a very busy day. I had a full schedule requiring me to be in the main lobby of the downtown corporate tower to oversee the physical integration of Sterling Media Group into our headquarters. It was the exact same high-end corporate building where Chloe Davenport worked. And knowing my father's desperate need to show off, I knew exactly where he liked to take his future daughter-in-law for lunch to pretend he was a wealthy patriarch. I took a final sip of my espresso, letting the bitter heat warm my chest. The trap was set, the paperwork was being drafted, and the golden child was about to have his fragile facade shattered in the middle of a marble lobby. The main lobby of the downtown corporate tower was a sprawling cathedral of glass steel and imported Italian marble. It was a space designed to intimidate. Every echoing footstep belonged to someone who either managed millions or was trying desperately to acquire them. At 11:45 on Tuesday morning, I stood on the glass-enclosed mezzanine, overlooking the ground floor. My chief operating officer, Renee, was standing next to me, holding a tablet displaying the newly integrated employee rosters for Sterling Media Group. We had spent the last 3 hours on the executive floor, systematically restructuring their management team. Now I was simply taking a moment to observe the flow of my new employees as they headed out for their lunch break. That was when my father walked through the revolving brass doors. Calvin Thomas did not just enter a room, he attempted to conquer it through sheer volume and aggressive posturing. He was wearing a cream-colored linen suit that might have looked impressive at a summer garden party, but looked entirely out of place in a high-finance corporate headquarters. His posture was rigid, his chin tilted upward in that familiar arrogant angle. He adjusted the lapels of his jacket and checked his gold watch, making sure the heavy metal caught the light. He wanted everyone in that lobby to know he was a man of immense importance. I watched from the mezzanine, leaning my forearms against the cool glass railing. A bitter smile played at the corners of my mouth. He had absolutely no idea that he was standing inside the belly of the beast. He had no idea that the massive logo etched into the marble wall behind the reception desk belonged to his daughter. My father marched directly toward the main security desk. In a building like this, discretion was the ultimate currency. Executives spoke in hushed tones and moved with quiet purpose. But Calvin did not understand real wealth. He only understood the loud, flashy imitation of it. His voice boomed across the lobby, echoing off the high ceilings. "Good morning," he announced to the security guard, leaning heavily against the polished stone counter. "I am Calvin Thomas. I am here to take my future daughter-in-law, Chloe Davenport, to lunch. She is a junior executive with Sterling Media Group." The guard, a seasoned professional who dealt with billionaires on a daily basis, simply nodded and asked for his identification to print a visitor badge. But my father was not satisfied with a simple, quiet transaction. He needed an audience. He turned slightly, ensuring his voice carried to a group of young professionals waiting by the elevator bank. Several of them were wearing Sterling Media Group lanyards. "I am treating her to that new French place down the street," Calvin continued unprompted, waving his hand dismissively. "We have a lot of wedding details to finalize. My son Jamal and I are sparing no expense for this event. When you manage a family trust as successful as ours, you learn that quality is the only thing that matters." I closed my eyes for a brief second, absorbing the sheer second-hand embarrassment of his performance. He was standing in a lobby surrounded by people with Ivy League financial degrees, bragging about a trust fund that did not exist to pay for a wedding he was currently bankrupting himself to afford. He was so deeply intimidated by Chloe's Boston lawyer parents that he felt the need to prove his worth to random administrative assistants and junior marketers. He wanted these young white-collar workers to look at him and see a wealthy black patriarch, a titan of industry. Instead, he just looked like a man trying much too hard. Renee glanced up from her tablet, following my line of sight down to the lobby. "Is there a problem down there, Simone?" she asked, noting the loud, booming voice that was currently disrupting the low hum of corporate efficiency. "Security can have him escorted out if he is causing a disturbance." "No, Renee," I said softly, keeping my eyes locked on the cream-colored suit. "There is no disturbance. That is just a man who thinks he is walking on solid ground when he is actually standing on a trap door. Let him enjoy his moment." Down below, Calvin had received his temporary visitor badge. He did not clip it discreetly to his belt like most guests. He clipped it front and center on his lapel, treating it like a medal of honor. He walked away from the security desk and positioned himself right in the center of the main elevator lobby. He stood with his feet planted wide, his hands clasped behind his back, looking up at the digital floor indicators. Two young women with sterling lanyards walked past him holding coffee cups. My father offered them a wide, charismatic smile. "Beautiful building you have here," he said, his voice projecting effortlessly. "I was just telling my broker I might need to look into acquiring some commercial space in this district. My son and I are looking to expand our portfolio before his wedding." The women exchanged a polite but confused glance, nodding nervously before hurrying away. They did not care about his portfolio. They just wanted to get to the salad bar before the noon rush. It was a tragic comedy playing out in real time. For 35 years, this man had made me feel incredibly small. He had convinced me that my ambitions were embarrassing, that my lack of a traditional degree made me worthless. He had stood on the steps of an upscale country club just 3 days ago and told me I did not fit the aesthetic of his successful family. He had shoved a $100 bill at me like I was a nuisance he needed to sweep off his porch. And now here he was, standing in the lobby of a skyscraper that my company managed, bragging to my employees about a financial empire that was completely imaginary. By Friday afternoon, my legal team would formally own the debt that was currently suffocating him. He was a king without a kingdom, and he had marched right into my throne room to show off his empty crown. I checked the sleek silver watch on my wrist. It was almost noon. Chloe would be coming down for lunch at any moment. She would step out of those elevators expecting to see her charming, wealthy future father-in-law, ready to take her out and spoil her. "Renee," I said, turning away from the glass railing, "I am going to head down to the main lobby to grab a coffee. Go ahead and finalize the termination packages for the redundant Sterling executives. I will review them after lunch." I did not wait for her reply. I walked gracefully toward the executive elevator, my heels sinking slightly into the plush carpet. I pressed the call button and watched the brass doors slide open. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor. I was not angry anymore. I was completely composed. My father wanted to put on a show for his future daughter-in-law and her corporate colleagues. It was only right that the chief executive officer made a guest appearance. The smooth descent of the private executive elevator gave me exactly 30 seconds to center my thoughts. When the polished brass doors slid open on the ground floor, I stepped out into a completely different atmosphere. The main lobby was a massive cavern of acoustic perfection designed so that high-powered conversations remained discreet murmurs. The scent of expensive artisanal coffee and imported leather briefcases filled the air. I walked gracefully across the Italian marble floor, heading straight for the sleek espresso bar, tucked into the far corner of the atrium. I ordered a simple black coffee and stood near the mahogany counter, waiting for the barista. As I turned around, holding my warm paper cup, the sea of tailored navy and charcoal suits parted just enough for my father to spot me. I watched the exact moment his eyes locked onto my face. The charismatic, wealthy patriarch's smile he had been flashing to the Sterling Media Group employees vanished in an instant. It was replaced by a deep, ugly scowl that completely contorted his features. He excused himself abruptly from the group of administrative assistants he had been cornering. He marched directly across the expanse of the lobby, moving with aggressive, furious purpose. His heavy footsteps echoed slightly against the stone floor. In his bright cream-colored linen suit, he looked like a loud, desperate tourist who had wandered into a high-security vault. He did not bother to pull me aside or lower his voice. He wanted an audience. He wanted to assert his dominance publicly, just like he had done on the steps of the country club. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice slicing harshly through the ambient noise of the corporate lobby. "Applying for a receptionist job." He let out a loud, mocking laugh that immediately drew the attention of several people standing nearby. "I told you, Simone, high-end places like this do background checks. They do not hire people who quit school." The sheer projection was breathtaking. Here was a man 90 days behind on a massive second mortgage, standing in a building he could not afford to clean, lecturing the owner of that building about background checks. I did not flinch. I did not drop my gaze. I stood perfectly still, letting his insult hang in the air for everyone to hear. "Hello, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly modulated, calm and steady. "It is a public commercial building. I am simply getting a cup of coffee." "Do not play your games with me," he hissed, taking a step closer to try and intimidate me with his physical size. "You followed me here. You are trying to sabotage your brother again. You could not ruin the engagement party on Saturday, so you tracked us down to embarrass me in front of Chloe." I took a slow sip of my coffee, enjoying the bitter, dark roast. "I did not follow you anywhere, Dad," I replied flatly. "I have actual business in this building." "Business?" he scoffed loudly, waving his hand dismissively. He made sure the security guard stationed by the turnstiles heard him. "What business? Polishing the marble floors, delivering lunch orders." "Let me make something very clear to you right now, Simone. Chloe is a very important executive in this tower. She works for Sterling Media Group. She has a professional reputation to uphold. If her colleagues see her associating with a college dropout who hustles on the streets for a living, it will reflect poorly on Jamal." He was laying his entire delusion out on the table. The depth of his ignorance was staggering. He truly believed Chloe was the absolute pinnacle of corporate success, not realizing she was just a mid-level employee at a company I had literally purchased the night before. He believed Jamal was a king marrying a queen, and that I was the court jester threatening to ruin the royal wedding. I glanced over my father's shoulder and made eye contact with the head security guard. The guard recognized me immediately. He stood up straight and shifted his weight, preparing to step in and physically remove the loud man in the linen suit for harassing the chief executive officer. I gave the guard a barely perceptible shake of my head. I raised one finger, signaling him to stand down. I wanted this entire scene to play out naturally. "You need to turn around and walk right back out those revolving doors," Calvin ordered, pointing a thick, stubby finger toward the street exit. "Jamal and I have worked entirely too hard to build our network and our family brand. We are taking Chloe to a 5-star restaurant for lunch today. We are discussing the premium floral arrangements and the caterers for the wedding. Things you know absolutely nothing about because you refuse to elevate yourself. Are you paying those expensive caterers with actual cash, or are you just opening another high-interest line of credit?" I asked softly. The question was a precision strike. It bypassed his ego and hit the direct center of his financial panic. His face flushed a dark, angry purple. The smug arrogance fractured for a split second, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. He looked around frantically to ensure none of the eavesdropping employees had heard my question. "What did you just say to me?" he demanded, his voice trembling slightly beneath the anger. "I asked how you are paying for the flowers, Dad," I repeated, taking another calm step forward so I was well within his personal space. "Because high-end places like this do not just do background checks. They do credit checks too. And I imagine a wedding of this caliber requires a significant amount of liquidity that a retired city worker might struggle to produce." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He was trying to figure out exactly how much I knew, but his desperate need to maintain his facade kicked back in, overriding his fear. He puffed his chest back out, attempting to look down his nose at me. "You are just jealous," he sputtered, jabbing his finger inches from my face. "You are bitter and jealous because your brother is succeeding while you are still struggling to find your way. You are a failure, Simone. You always have been. Now get out of this building before I have that security guard throw you out for trespassing." I took another calm sip of my coffee. I did not move a single inch toward the exit. I just smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that carried the weight of a multi-million-dollar bank account and a freshly drafted deed of trust. My father saw that smile, and for the first time in his life, he actually took a half step back. He did not know why he was suddenly afraid, but his instincts were finally warning him. He was standing on the tracks, and he could finally hear the whistle of the train. The sharp, melodic chime of the private executive elevator cut through the heavy tension of the lobby, like a silver blade. The heavy brass doors slid apart smoothly, revealing the plush wood-paneled interior reserved strictly for senior leadership. My father instantly dropped his defensive posture. The sudden fear that had briefly flashed across his face vanished entirely, replaced by the desperate need to perform. He smoothed the lapels of his loud cream-colored linen suit and pasted on a wide, charismatic smile, turning his attention away from me and toward the elevator bank. Stepping out onto the marble floor was Chloe Davenport. She looked exactly the way a junior executive trying to survive a massive corporate acquisition should look. She wore a tailored charcoal gray sheath dress, her blonde hair pulled back into a severe but elegant twist. She was holding a silver tablet tightly against her chest, deep in conversation with her department head, a formidable woman named Miranda, who was currently sweating through the realities of the Apex Acquisitions restructuring. Chloe was nodding eagerly, hanging on to every word Miranda said, desperate to prove her worth and secure her position in the new corporate hierarchy. As they walked past the velvet ropes, Chloe casually scanned the lobby and spotted my father. Her face immediately lit up with a practiced bright smile. She adjusted her posture, shifting from the eager junior employee into the role of the beloved future daughter-in-law. She genuinely believed she was looking at a man of immense generational wealth. She believed the lies Jamal had fed her about his successful family trust and his father's sprawling investment portfolio. She thought Calvin Thomas was a man of high society, a patriarch who could casually drop $100,000 on a wedding without blinking an eye. "Ah, there she is," my father boomed, his voice echoing loudly across the polished stone. He took 2 large steps toward her, opening his arms wide in a grand theatrical gesture. "The future, Mrs. Thomas." Chloe stepped forward, her smile widening. "Mr. Thomas, it is so wonderful to see you," she said, her voice carrying that polite upper-middle-class polish. "I am so sorry I am running a few minutes late. Miranda and I were just finishing a rather intense briefing regarding the new company structure." "Take your time, my dear," my father replied loudly, making sure the surrounding security guards and receptionists heard him. "A family as successful as ours understands the demands of the corporate grind. I have a table waiting for us at Le Petit Chateau whenever you are ready." Chloe reached out to briefly hug him, but as she pulled back, her gaze naturally drifted over his shoulder. She saw me. The physical transformation was immediate and absolute. It happened in terrifying slow motion. The bright, confident smile froze on her face before shattering entirely into a look of pure, unadulterated horror. The blood drained out of her cheeks so fast she looked as though she might faint right there on the Italian marble. Her perfectly manicured fingers lost their grip, and the silver tablet she was holding slipped, tumbling down to strike the floor with a loud, sharp clatter. She did not bend down to pick it up. She could not move. Her expensive heels were firmly rooted to the ground. She knew exactly who I was. Just 3 hours prior, a company-wide memorandum had been distributed to every single employee at Sterling Media Group. That memo outlined the terms of the corporate buyout, and featured a high-resolution photograph of the chief executive officer of their new parent company. My face had been plastered across her inbox, her digital dashboard, and the financial news websites she read every morning. But even beyond the corporate memo, the cognitive dissonance fracturing her mind in that exact second must have been agonizing. Jamal had told her his sister was a bitter, uneducated college dropout who scraped by on embarrassing little side hustles. He had told her I was banned from the engagement party because I was too poor and unrefined to mingle with her prestigious Boston family. Yet the woman standing 10 feet in front of her, radiating absolute authority in a bespoke emerald power suit while casually sipping a dark roast coffee, was the apex predator of her corporate ecosystem. Beside her, Miranda also followed her line of sight. The senior department head immediately stiffened. Miranda did not look horrified, she simply looked terrified for her own job security. Miranda quickly took a deliberate half-step away from my father, creating physical distance between herself and the loud man in the linen suit. She then offered me a deep, respectful nod of submission, acknowledging the absolute top of the food chain. My father, completely oblivious to the silent power dynamic playing out in front of him, misinterpreted Chloe's shock entirely. He assumed her pale face and dropped tablet were reactions of disgust at my presence. He assumed she had recognized me from the dark driveway of the country club and was appalled to see me loitering in her prestigious office building. His chest puffed out even further. He placed a protective hand on Chloe's shoulder, leaning in to comfort her. "I sincerely apologize that you have to see this." "Chloe," my father said, his voice dripping with condescending pity as he gestured vaguely in my direction. "I know you saw her outside the venue on Saturday night. I thought I had handled the situation, but unfortunately, my estranged daughter has decided to wander in off the street and track us down here today." Chloe let out a strangled, gasping sound. She looked frantically between my father and me, her eyes wide and panicked like a trapped animal. She opened her mouth to speak, but her vocal cords completely failed her. "Do not worry, my dear." My father continued, completely digging his own grave with a bulldozer. "I was just telling her to leave. I know a high-end corporate environment like this is no place for someone who refuses to get a real education. I have already asked security to stand by. She was just begging for a handout, but she will be gone before we head to the restaurant." "Is that not right, Simone?" He shot me a dark, warning glare, silently demanding that I play along and slink away into the shadows. I did not move. I did not blink. I lowered the paper coffee cup from my lips and met Chloe's terrified gaze. I offered her a very slight, very cold smile. The lobby seemed to hold its collective breath. The ambient noise of clicking keyboards and ringing phones faded into the background. My father stood there grinning like a victorious king, completely unaware that he was standing on a landmine that his future daughter-in-law had just stepped on. He had built his entire identity on the illusion of power. He was about to learn what actual power looked like. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, but my father, oblivious to the shifting tectonic plates beneath his feet, finally broke it. He let out a loud, booming laugh that bounced off the marble walls. It was a practiced, theatrical sound meant to project dominance and ease the tension. "I am so sorry you had to witness this display, Chloe," he said, shaking his head with exaggerated pity. He reached out as if to guide her away from me. "You can choose your friends, but unfortunately you cannot choose your family. I assure you, Jamal and I have distanced ourselves from this kind of behavior. She was just loitering, trying to secure an entry-level position, but I have already instructed her to leave. Let us head to the restaurant. The valet has the car waiting." Chloe did not move toward him. Instead, she took a very deliberate step backward, creating a physical barrier between herself and my father. Her chest was heaving as she struggled to pull oxygen into her lungs. She looked at him as if he had just sprouted a second head. "Mr. Thomas?" she stammered, her voice cracking wildly. "What are you talking about?" My father frowned, slightly confused by her reaction. "I am talking about Simone," he said, pointing a thick finger in my direction. "I am apologizing that my estranged daughter is harassing you at your place of employment." Chloe shook her head frantically, her perfectly styled hair falling out of place. "She is not harassing me, Mr. Thomas," she gasped, gripping the edge of her blazer. "And she is certainly not applying for a receptionist job." My father let out another condescending chuckle. "Chloe, I know you are trying to be polite because she is Jamal's sister, but you do not need to defend her. She is a college dropout. She does not belong in a building like this. She owns this building," Chloe practically screamed. The words echoed through the massive cavern of the lobby. Several people waiting by the elevators turned their heads. The security guards shifted their weight. My father froze, his hands still suspended in the air. The condescending smile physically melted off his face, leaving behind a blank, uncomprehending mask. What he whispered, the booming confidence entirely stripped from his voice. Chloe was trembling now, tears of absolute panic welling in her eyes. "She is Simone Thomas," she said, her voice frantic and breathless. "She is the chief executive officer of Apex Acquisitions. They just bought our entire firm yesterday. She is the owner of this tower. She is my ultimate boss." My father stood perfectly still, like a man who had just been struck by lightning but had not yet realized he was dead. His brain simply could not process the information. He looked at Chloe, and then he slowly turned his head to look at me. For the first time in my entire life, Calvin Thomas actually looked at me. He did not look at the rebellious teenager he had discarded. He did not look at the scapegoat he blamed for his own shortcomings. He looked at the bespoke emerald silk of my suit. He looked at the flawless cut of the diamond on my finger. He looked at the way the head of security was standing at attention, waiting for my single command. He finally saw the empire I had built while he was busy playing dress-up. "That is impossible," he muttered, taking a stumbling step backward. "Jamal said you were doing little consulting hustles. You dropped out of state college. You do not have the pedigree for this." Before I could say a word, Miranda, the senior department head, stepped forward. She placed a protective hand on Chloe's arm and fixed my father with a glare of pure corporate ice. "Sir, I do not know who you are, but you are currently raising your voice at the chief executive officer of a multi-billion-dollar holdings company." She turned her attention to me, her posture instantly shifting to deep deference. "Ms. Thomas, is this man bothering you? Shall I have security escort him off the premises?" The absolute humiliation in my father's eyes was a beautiful, terrible thing to witness. He had spent his entire morning trying to impress administrative assistants, and now he was being publicly disciplined by one. He was being threatened with expulsion from a building he had just claimed to be shopping for office space in. "No, Miranda," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly composed. "That will not be necessary." He was just leaving. I walked forward, closing the distance between us. My father shrank back, visibly intimidated by my proximity. I turned my attention to Chloe, who looked like she was waiting for a firing squad. "Chloe," I said, keeping my tone strictly professional, "do not panic. I reviewed your quarterly performance metrics this morning. Your campaign for the regional tech launch was highly effective. Apex Acquisitions values talent, and your job is entirely secure." Chloe let out a shaky breath, a single tear spilling over her eyelashes. "Thank you, Miss Thomas," she whispered. However, I continued, my eyes locking onto hers. "As you move forward in your career, I highly suggest you conduct better background checks on your personal investments. You are marrying into a family that specializes in creating very expensive illusions. I would hate to see a bright young executive bankrupt herself paying for a wedding to a man whose entire net worth is a negative $250,000. Chloe's jaw dropped. She looked at my father, and the realization hit her like a freight train. The rumors of the wealthy family trust, the extravagant lifestyle, the refusal to let me attend the engagement party. It all suddenly made terrifying sense. She was not marrying a prince. She was marrying a fraud. I finally turned back to my father. He looked physically ill. The cream-colored linen suit suddenly looked cheap and ridiculous. His breathing was shallow, and his hands were shaking at his sides. He had absolutely nothing left to say. His entire world, his entire false identity, had just been dismantled in less than 5 minutes. "Enjoy your lunch at Le Petit Chateau, Dad," I said, offering him a final cold smile. "I am sure they will be happy to accept whatever high-interest credit card Jamal is currently maxing out. Oh, and by the way..." I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to ensure he heard every single syllable of my next sentence. "Check your mail. The bank sent you an updated notice on your second mortgage this morning. I would pay very close attention to the new lien holder." I did not wait for his response. I simply turned my back on him and walked toward the private executive elevator. The brass doors opened immediately for me. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the penthouse. As the doors slid shut, I caught one final glimpse of the lobby. My father was standing alone, completely defeated, staring blankly at the floor, while Chloe Davenport hurriedly walked away from him in the opposite direction. The engagement was crumbling. The house of cards had collapsed, and I was heading back to the top floor to run my empire. I stepped out of the executive elevator, and the heavy silence of the penthouse floor immediately wrapped around me. The air up here was always crisp and perfectly climate-controlled. It was a stark contrast to the suffocating panic I had just left down in the lobby. I walked past the reception desk where my executive assistant David was already sorting through the afternoon mail. I gave him a brief nod and stepped into my office, letting the heavy mahogany doors click shut behind me. I had barely taken my seat behind the desk when the red light on my private console began to blink rapidly. It was an external call trying to bypass the corporate switchboard. I did not need caller identification to know exactly who was on the other end of the line. My father had just experienced the corporate equivalent of an earthquake, and his immediate instinct was to try and regain control. I reached out and pressed the mute button. The flashing red light continued its frantic rhythm, a silent testament to his desperation. For years, that kind of relentless pressure would have sent my heart racing. I would have answered the phone out of guilt or fear, bracing myself for a barrage of insults and manipulations. But today, I just sat back in my leather chair and watched the light flash until it finally went dark. Less than 30 seconds later, it started blinking again. He was relentless. He was standing on the sidewalk outside my building, furiously dialing my number, while his perfect world crumbled around him. He had realized the magnitude of my final warning. The updated notice on his mortgage was not an empty threat. It was a legal reality, and he needed to know exactly how much damage I was capable of inflicting. I picked up the intercom and buzzed David. "Block the incoming number I just routed to your terminal," I instructed, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Do not let it ring through to my office again." "Understood, Ms. Thomas," David replied efficiently. "If he attempts to call the main switchboard or uses a different number, you are to intercept it." I continued. "You are not to confirm my schedule, my location, or my mood. If he demands to speak with me, you will inform him that I am unavailable. You will not pass along any messages." It was a necessary boundary. Narcissists like my father feed on reaction. They use anger, guilt, and loud arguments as tools to keep you off balance. By completely severing his direct line of communication, I was starving him of his primary weapon. I was forcing him to sit in the uncomfortable silence of his own consequences. Over the next 2 hours, the sheer volume of his panic became documented in David's call logs. My father called the main Apex acquisition switchboard 14 times. He tried demanding, he tried threatening legal action, he even tried pretending there was a family medical emergency. Each time he was met with the polite, impenetrable wall of my executive team. David handled him with the kind of icy professionalism that infuriates men who are used to getting their way through intimidation. At 2 o'clock, David walked into my office holding a printed transcription report. He placed it gently on my desk. "He is escalating." "Ms. Thomas," David noted, maintaining his perfect composure. "He just left a 3-minute voicemail on the general inquiries line. I had the system transcribe it for your records. Do you want security to issue a formal trespass warning if he returns to the building?" I picked up the transcription. The words on the page painted a vivid picture of a man entirely unhinged, The first paragraph was filled with rage, demanding that I call him back immediately and stop playing these childish games. He called me disrespectful. He called me a liar. But by the second paragraph, the tone shifted dramatically. The anger fractured into genuine terror. He had finally checked his banking portal. He had seen the digital notification from First Piedmont Alliance confirming that his distressed residential loan had been sold and reassigned. And he had seen the name of the new lien holder, Apex Acquisitions. The final paragraph of the transcription was almost pathetic. He was begging. He was asking if we could just sit down and talk like a family. He promised to make Jamal apologize for the incident at the country club. He offered to buy me dinner. It was a dizzying whiplash from the man who had shoved $100 bill at me just a few days prior. He was not apologizing because he felt remorse. He was apologizing because I now held the deed to his house and the power to destroy his son's fake millionaire aesthetic. He had realized that his financial secrets, the crippling debt, the second mortgage, the non-existent trust fund, were no longer hidden in the shadows. They were sitting in a manila folder on my desk. If I exposed those documents to Chloe, or worse to her high society Boston parents, the wedding would be canceled instantly. The social standing my father had sacrificed everything to build would vanish overnight. "No, David," I said, sliding the transcription into the shredder beside my desk. "Let him panic. Let him exhaust himself trying to kick down a steel door. If he calls again, simply tell him that all future correspondence regarding his property must be directed to our legal department." David nodded and left the room. I turned my attention back to my computer monitor. I had multi-million-dollar portfolios to manage and a newly acquired subsidiary to restructure. I refused to let my father's self-inflicted crisis derail my productivity. The trap had been completely sprung. He was caught in the jaws of his own financial recklessness. He could leave all the voicemails he wanted, but it would not change the simple mathematical fact that he owed a massive debt and the bank was no longer interested in giving him extensions. My father was about to learn a very hard lesson about the difference between looking rich and actually being wealthy. Looking rich required constant maintenance, endless lies, and a crippling fear of exposure. Being wealthy meant I could turn off my phone, buy his debt, and go right back to work without missing a single beat. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself feeling a strange sense of peace. The little girl who used to beg for his approval was completely gone. In her place was a woman who understood the value of her own peace. My father was drowning in the deep end of the pool he had dug himself, and for the first time in my life, I was not going to throw him a life preserver. I was simply going to sit on the deck and watch. The following morning, the sleek atmosphere of the penthouse was briefly interrupted by the soft chime of my intercom. I pressed the silver button on my desk, keeping my eyes on the quarterly projections on my monitor. "Yes, David," I answered. "Ms. Thomas," my executive assistant said, his voice a perfectly neutral murmur. "Chloe Davenport from the marketing division is at the reception desk. She does not have an appointment, but she is asking if she might have 5 minutes of your time. She says it is extremely urgent." I paused, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I had expected my father to panic. I had expected him to blow up my phone and leave desperate voicemails. But I had not anticipated Chloe having the courage to march up to the executive suite on her own. It showed a level of professional grit that I actually respected. "Send her in, David," I instructed. A moment later, the heavy mahogany doors opened and Chloe stepped into my office. She looked entirely different from the polished, confident junior executive I had seen in the lobby yesterday. The tailored blazer was the same, but the energy was completely gone. Dark circles bruised the delicate skin under her eyes, indicating she had likely spent the entire night awake. She stood stiffly near the entrance, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as if waiting for a judge to read her sentence. "Please sit down, Chloe," I said, gesturing to one of the leather armchairs opposite my desk. She walked forward hesitantly and took a seat perching on the very edge of the cushion. She took a deep, shaky breath. "Ms. Thomas, I want to start by apologizing. She began, her voice tight with anxiety. I had absolutely no idea who you were yesterday. And I want to formally apologize for Calvin Thomas and his behavior in the lobby. It was completely unacceptable. I am terrified that the scene he caused is going to reflect poorly on my professional standing here at Apex Acquisitions. I folded my hands, resting them on the cool marble of my desk. I studied her face. She was not just embarrassed, she was genuinely afraid that her career was over. In the corporate world, perception was everything, and being publicly associated with a loud, belligerent man who had just insulted the chief executive officer was usually a career death sentence. Chloe, let me stop you right there, I said, my tone even and completely professional. I told you yesterday that your job is secure, and I meant it. Apex Acquisitions did not purchase your firm to fire its top performers over personal drama. Your marketing campaigns generated a 14% increase in engagement last quarter. As long as you continue to produce those numbers, you have a place in this building. I do not penalize my employees for their poor taste in future in-laws. The relief that washed over her face was so profound, she actually slumped back an inch into the chair. She let out an exhaling breath that sounded almost like a sob. Thank you, she whispered, pressing a hand to her chest. Thank you so much. I have worked so hard to get to this level. I was so afraid I was going to lose everything because of Jamal and his father. I noted the subtle shift in her language. She did not refer to them as her family. She referred to them as Jamal and his father, establishing a clear psychological distance. The confrontation in the lobby had clearly planted a massive seed of doubt in her mind. Since you brought up Jamal, I said, leaning forward slightly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to change the dynamic of the room. We need to have a brief off-the-record conversation, not as your chief executive officer, but as a woman who knows exactly who you are about to marry. Chloe swallowed hard, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the armrests. I did not talk to him last night, she confessed softly. I ignored his calls. After what you said in the lobby about his finances, about the credit cards, I did not know what to believe. He has always presented himself as a successful consultant. I am sure he has, I replied smoothly. My brother is a master of presentation. But presentation is not currency. I understand the wedding is going to be held at the Oak Ridge Country Club. That is an exclusive venue, Chloe. Between the catering, the premium floral arrangements, and the dress, a wedding of that caliber easily pushes past the $100,000 mark. It is currently sitting at $120,000, she admitted, her gaze dropping to the floor out of sheer embarrassment. And how exactly is Jamal paying for his half of that expense? I asked, my voice quiet but sharp, demanding absolute honesty. Chloe looked back up at me, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. He is paying for all of it, she said. My parents offered to contribute, but Jamal insisted. He said his family was traditional and that the groom's side would cover the entire event. He told me he was using the disbursements from his family trust. The words hung in the air. A family trust. I kept my expression completely neutral, betraying none of the dark amusement swirling in my chest. He told you he has a family trust? I repeated slowly. Yes. Chloe nodded, her confidence wavering slightly as she heard the words spoken aloud in this massive, powerful office. He said his grandfather built a massive real estate portfolio and that Calvin manages the trust. Jamal told me he receives a substantial quarterly dividend, which he supplements with his consulting income. He said the wedding was already entirely paid for out of this year's dividend. I watched her closely. She was not a gold digger. She was a smart, capable woman who had simply fallen in love with a man who lied to her with the ease of breathing. She had trusted his narrative because he wore the right watches, drove the right car, and his father backed up every single fabricated claim. Chloe, I asked softly, as a business professional working in corporate marketing, you analyze budgets and return on investments every single day. You demand documentation before you launch a campaign. Have you ever actually seen a statement from this family trust? Her eyes widened slightly. She opened her mouth to answer, but nothing came out. Has he ever shown you a tax document outlining his quarterly dividends? I continued, the questions falling like steady drops of cold rain. Have you ever met the estate lawyer who supposedly manages this massive real estate portfolio? Have you seen the deed to a single piece of property that Jamal actually owns? No, she whispered, the color draining from her face as the logical side of her brain finally dismantled the romantic illusion. He always handled the finances. He told me it was old money and that his father preferred to keep the paperwork private. I just believed him. I believed them both. I sat back in my chair, giving her the space to process the terrifying reality of her situation. It is easy to believe the lie, when the lie looks like a custom-tailored suit and sounds like a fairy tale, I told her. My father spent my entire childhood teaching Jamal how to project wealth. They believe that if they act like they belong in the upper class, the universe will eventually reward them. But they do not have a portfolio, Chloe. They do not have generational wealth. Chloe stared at me, her breathing shallow. Then where is the money coming from? She pleaded, her voice cracking. The deposits on the venue, the flowers, the ring on my finger. If there is no trust fund, how is he paying for this? I looked at the young woman sitting across from me, realizing that I was about to drop an anvil on her entire future. But it was a necessary destruction. She deserved the truth before she legally bound herself to a sinking ship. I reached across my desk and pulled a single manila folder from the top drawer. It was the same folder Derek had given me the day before, containing the financial forensic workup on my brother and my father. I placed the folder flat on the marble surface, keeping my hand resting on top of it. I was ready to show her exactly what kind of men she was dealing with. I opened the folder and flipped past the executive summaries, going straight to the historical financial data my investigator had pulled. I turned the document around so it faced Chloe. Take a look, I said softly. This is the grand family trust Jamal has been bragging about. Chloe leaned forward, her eyes scanning the lines of text and banking codes. She frowned, her marketing brain trying to make sense of the modest numbers on the page. This is a life insurance policy, she noted, her voice tight with confusion. And the beneficiary is you. I nodded, leaning back in my chair. My grandfather Theodore was a practical man. He did not own a sprawling real estate empire. He owned one small brick house and a single life insurance policy. When he passed away, he left that policy specifically earmarked for my college education. It was $50,000, not millions, just enough to give me a solid start in life without taking on massive student loans. Chloe looked up from the paper. But you said you dropped out. Calvin told everyone you quit because you could not handle the coursework. I quit because the tuition check bounced. I replied, the memory of that humiliating day in the registrar's office still a cold stone in my chest. When I was 18, my father was granted temporary custodianship of that account until I officially enrolled. He forged my signature on a release form and drained the entire $50,000 in a single afternoon. Chloe's eyes widened in horror. What did he do with it? She asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. He bought Jamal a brand new luxury sports car, I stated flatly. Jamal was rushing a prestigious fraternity at his university, and my father decided that his son looking like old money was more important than his daughter actually getting an education. That is the great family trust, Chloe. It was my tuition money, stolen and spent on a depreciating asset so my brother could pretend to be a prince. Chloe slumped back in her chair, looking physically ill. She pressed her fingertips to her temples as if trying to keep her world from spinning out of control. If that was the only money, she reasoned, her voice trembling, then how are they paying the country club right now? The floral deposits alone were $15,000. I reached over and turned to the next page in the folder. I slid the copy of the lending agreement toward her. They are paying for it with the roof over my parents' heads, I explained, watching her eyes dart across the heavy black ink of the mortgage documents. 10 months ago, my father took out a massive second mortgage on the family home. He pulled out every single dime of equity our grandfather had built, and handed it directly to Jamal to fund his fake millionaire lifestyle and this wedding. Chloe let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with her hand. He mortgaged his house for a wedding, she whispered, the sheer financial lunacy of it completely breaking her corporate brain. And he is currently 90 days past due on the payments I added, delivering the final crushing blow. The bank is initiating foreclosure. Your future father-in-law is functionally bankrupt. And your future husband. I turned to the final page showing the staggering credit bureau data is carrying over $200,000 in toxic, high-interest consumer debt. If you sign that marriage certificate, Chloe, his debt becomes a marital problem. Your pristine credit score, your executive salary, it will all be drained to pay for the illusion he sold you. The silence that followed was absolute. The ambient hum of the city outside the penthouse windows felt entirely disconnected from the devastating reality inside the room. Chloe stared at the documents, her chest heaving as she pulled in ragged breaths. She was a woman who built marketing campaigns based on return on investment. She was looking at the worst investment of her entire life. She did not cry. The initial panic and embarrassment from yesterday had completely burned away, leaving behind a cold, hardened realization. She reached out and touched the edge of the credit report, her perfectly manicured fingernail tracing the massive negative balances. He told me I was the best thing that ever happened to his family, she said, her voice dropping to a hollow whisper. He told me we were building a legacy together. He was looking for an underwriter. I corrected her gently but firmly. He was looking for someone with an executive salary to keep the lights on when the bank finally cuts him off. Chloe slowly closed the manila folder. She stood up from the leather armchair, her posture shifting. The terrified junior executive who had walked into my office begging for her job was gone. In her place was a woman who had just survived a massive collision and was assessing the wreckage. She smoothed the front of her charcoal blazer and picked up her phone. "Thank you, Ms. Thomas," she said, looking me directly in the eyes. "I know you did not have to show me this. You could have let me walk right into the trap." "You are a talented woman, Chloe," I replied, offering her a respectful nod. "You belong in a boardroom making real money. You do not belong in a courtroom fighting off collection agencies because of a fragile man's ego. What you do with this information is entirely up to you." "I know exactly what I am going to do," she stated, her voice remarkably steady. "Have a productive afternoon, Ms. Thomas." She turned and walked out of the office, the heavy mahogany doors clicking shut behind her. I watched her go, knowing perfectly well that the rehearsal dinner scheduled for Friday evening was going to be an absolute bloodbath. I turned my attention back to my computer monitor, ready to resume my actual work, but a soft knock on the side door of my office interrupted me. Harrison, my lead corporate attorney, walked in. He did not look like his usual composed self. He looked like a wolf who had just secured a very large meal. He was holding a thick black leather folio. He bypassed the guest chairs and walked straight to my desk, placing the folio squarely in the center of my blotter. "It is done," Simone Harrison announced, a rare grin breaking through his professional exterior. "The wire transfers cleared First Piedmont Alliance 15 minutes ago. We acquired the entire tranche of distressed residential debt, just as you requested." I reached out and unclasped the folio. The scent of fresh ink and thick legal paper filled the space. I flipped past the bulk acquisition summaries until I found the specific addendum I was looking for. There it was. The official assignment of the deed of trust for a modest brick house in the suburbs. I ran my finger over the printed text. The original lender was completely removed. In their place, officially recorded and legally binding, was Apex Acquisitions. I thought about the beat-up compact car I drove for years while Jamal cruised around in his German luxury sedan. I thought about the nights I stayed up until 3 in the morning building financial models while my father told our relatives I was struggling and lost. The deed in my hand was not just a legal document, it was 35 years of vindication printed on heavy cardstock. They did not put up any resistance, I asked, looking up at Harrison. None, he confirmed. They were thrilled to get the bad paper off their books before the quarter ended. They transferred the servicing rights immediately. As of this exact second, Simone, you are the sole lien holder of your father's property. You are the bank. A slow, deep sense of satisfaction settled into my bones. The universe had a fascinating way of balancing the scales. My father had stolen my education money to buy his golden child a car. He had barred me from a country club because I did not fit his wealthy aesthetic. He had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. And now with a single signature, I literally owned the roof over his head. Harrison stood by the desk, waiting for his next directive. "What are the orders regarding this specific asset?" he asked, maintaining his professional cadence. "Do we initiate the standard restructuring offer, or do we proceed with the default protocols?" I looked down at the deed of trust. My father had demanded a $500 wedding gift from me just yesterday. He had laughed in my face in the lobby of my own building. He had exhausted every single ounce of grace I could ever possibly offer. "There will be no restructuring, Harrison," I said, my voice cold and absolute. "The borrower is already in severe violation of the original lending terms. I want the loan accelerated immediately. Draft the final notice of demand for the entire remaining balance." "When do you want it delivered?" he asked. "I want it in my hands by Friday afternoon." I instructed, closing the black folio. "I am attending a pre-wedding rehearsal dinner this weekend, and I believe it is time I finally brought a gift." Friday evening arrived with a crisp autumn chill that matched the ice currently running through my veins. I instructed my driver to pull directly up to the valet stand of Le Petit Chateau, the most exclusive French restaurant in the city. The exterior was understated, just a simple, polished brass plaque next to heavy oak doors, but everyone in the financial district knew that securing a private room here required a staggering minimum spend. It was exactly the kind of place my father would choose to project his fabricated wealth to Chloe's elite Boston parents. I stepped out of the Maybach, smoothing the front of my tailored black velvet suit. I had chosen my outfit with specific intent. It was not flashy. It did not scream for attention. It was simply the armor of a woman who owned every room she walked into. I pushed through the heavy doors and stepped into the warm, dimly lit foyer. The scent of roasted truffles and expensive Burgundy wine hung heavy in the air. The main dining room was a symphony of clinking crystal and hushed conversations among the city's upper echelon. I walked directly to the maitre d' stand, where a tall, imposing man in a pristine tuxedo was monitoring an electronic reservation tablet. "Good evening," I said, my voice perfectly level. "I am here for the Thomas rehearsal dinner." The host offered a practiced, polite smile and tapped his screen. "May I have your name, madame?" "Simone Thomas," I replied. His finger traced down the list of approved guests. The polite smile faltered slightly, replaced by a rigid mask of professional exclusion. "I am very sorry, Miss Thomas," he said, his tone dropping to a discreet whisper meant to avoid a scene. "I do not see your name on the approved guest list. The private event in the Bordeaux room is strictly limited to the names provided by the host." "I know I am not on the list," I said, maintaining eye contact. "I am the groom's sister. I will be joining them now." I took a step forward, but the host immediately shifted his weight, blocking my path to the hallway. "I must apologize, madame, but Mr. Calvin Thomas gave explicit instructions. He was very clear that no unlisted individuals are to be admitted under any circumstances. If you would like, I can send a message to the room to see if he wishes to make an exception." He was doing his job exactly as he had been instructed. My father had anticipated that I might try to show up and had weaponized the restaurant staff to keep his perfect aesthetic secure. For a fraction of a second, the old childhood rejection flared in my chest. The familiar sting of being shut out, standing on the wrong side of the door while my family celebrated without me. But that feeling was immediately extinguished by the cold, heavy reality of the black leather folio sitting on my desk back at the penthouse. I did not need my father's permission to enter a room ever again. Before I could politely inform the host that he was making a significant career mistake, a frantic voice called out from the hallway behind him. Wait! Stop immediately! I looked past the host to see Julian, the owner and managing partner of Le Petit Chateau, rushing toward us. Julian was a brilliant restaurateur who had nearly lost his entire business during the economic downturn 3 years ago. He had survived only because Apex Acquisitions had purchased his commercial real estate debt and restructured his leases on extremely favorable terms. I had personally approved the deal because I liked his food and respected his work ethic. Julian practically shoved the host aside, his face pale with panic. "Miss Thomas," he breathed, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. "What an absolute honor. I had no idea you were dining with us tonight." "Julian." I greeted him with a warm, genuine smile. "It is lovely to see you. Your host was just informing me that my father Calvin did not include me on the guest list for the private dinner in the Bordeaux room." Julian turned a furious glare upon the host, who was now shrinking back against the mahogany podium, realizing he had just attempted to bounce the woman who literally owned the ground beneath their feet. "There has been a terrible misunderstanding," Julian said quickly, turning back to me with an apologetic bow. "Any room in this establishment is yours, Ms. Thomas. Please allow me to escort you personally." "Thank you, Julian," I said, stepping past the host. He led me down the long, opulent hallway, away from the noise of the main dining floor. The walls were lined with vintage wine bottles behind floor-to-ceiling glass. As we approached the heavy double doors of the Bordeaux room, the muffled sound of laughter and applause drifted out into the hallway. Julian reached for the brass handle, but paused, looking at me, seeking silent confirmation. I gave him a single nod. He pushed the heavy doors open and stepped aside, allowing me to walk past him into the private dining room. The Bordeaux room was breathtaking. A massive crystal chandelier cast a warm golden glow over a long banquet table covered in white linen. The centerpieces were sprawling arrangements of white roses and imported orchids. The crystal water goblets gleamed alongside heavy silver cutlery. It was an aesthetic masterpiece of wealth and privilege. And standing at the absolute head of the table holding a flute of vintage champagne was my brother Jamal. He was in the middle of a speech. The room was captivated. Chloe's parents, a distinguished-looking older couple in conservative designer clothing, were leaning forward, listening intently. My mother Brenda was dabbing her eyes with a napkin, playing the role of the emotional matriarch. My father Calvin was sitting to Jamal's right, puffing his chest out with absolute pride. Chloe sat to Jamal's left. She looked pale and entirely detached, staring blankly at the expensive floral arrangement in front of her. My father Calvin taught me that true wealth is not just about the numbers in a bank account, Jamal was saying, his voice projecting with that practiced, arrogant cadence. It is about legacy. It is about building an empire that lasts for generations. The Thomas family trust was built on those exact principles of hard work and intelligent investments. I stepped fully into the room, and the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me. "And that is exactly what Chloe and I are bringing to this marriage." Jamal continued, raising his glass toward his future in-laws. "A foundation of generational stability. A legacy of success that we will pass down to our own children. To the Davenport and Thomas families, may our future be as golden as our past." "Hear, hear," my father boomed, raising his own glass. Several people at the table echoed the sentiment, raising their champagne flutes to their lips. But as my father lowered his glass, his eyes caught the movement at the back of the room. He saw me standing there, framed by the dark mahogany walls. The vintage champagne slid down the wrong pipe. Calvin choked, coughing violently into his linen napkin. His face turned a deep, alarming shade of purple as he sputtered, struggling to draw breath. Jamal, annoyed by the interruption to his grand finale, turned to see what was causing the commotion. His arrogant, triumphant smile completely froze. The hand holding his champagne flute trembled slightly, causing a few drops of the expensive liquid to spill over the rim and onto his custom-tailored suit jacket. The sudden violent shift in the atmosphere was palpable. Chloe's parents turned around in their seats to look at the back of the room. The entire table followed their gaze, The room went completely dead silent. The only sound was the soft hum of the climate control system and the frantic, ragged breathing of my father as he tried to clear his lungs. I did not say a word. I simply walked forward, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor. I moved with deliberate, unhurried grace, tracing the perimeter of the table until I reached the single empty chair positioned near the foot of the table, ironically placed right next to Chloe's father. I pulled the heavy upholstered chair out and gracefully took my seat. I reached forward, picking up the crisp linen napkin and placing it carefully across my lap. I folded my hands, resting them on the edge of the table. I looked directly down the length of the table, meeting Jamal's terrified gaze. "Please," I said, my voice dropping into the absolute silence like a stone into a glassy pond. "Do not let me interrupt. You were just telling us all about the Thomas Family Trust. I would love to hear more about this generational wealth." The heavy crystal champagne flute in Jamal's hand shook so violently that the remaining vintage liquid splashed over the rim, soaking into the pristine white tablecloth. The sheer terror in his eyes morphed almost instantly into an explosive, frantic rage. He slammed his glass down onto the table with a sharp crack that echoed through the private dining room. "Who let you in here?" he demanded, his voice cracking as he shoved his heavy oak chair back. He marched down the length of the banquet table, completely abandoning his polished Prince Charming persona. "I told you to stay away from my fiancé's family. I told you we did not want you here." He stopped just inches from where I was sitting, looming over me. His chest heaved and his fists were clenched tight at his sides. For a man who had just been bragging about his refined pedigree, he looked entirely unhinged. I did not flinch. I did not lean back in my chair. I simply looked up at him, observing the beads of sweat forming along his perfectly faded hairline. "You do not own this restaurant, Jamal," I replied, my voice maintaining that smooth, quiet authority. "And considering I hold a significant financial stake in this establishment, the owner was more than happy to show me to my seat." My father, Calvin, practically leaped out of his chair at the head of the table. The deep purple flush of his face had drained into a sickly pale gray. The cream-colored linen suit he had worn so proudly yesterday was gone, replaced by a rented tuxedo that suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for him. He rushed around the table, his heavy dress shoes slipping slightly on the polished hardwood floor. He reached my side, panting heavily, smelling of nervous sweat and cheap cologne. He reached out and grabbed the back of my chair, his thick fingers digging into the upholstery. "Get up, Simone," Calvin hissed, leaning down so his face was entirely too close to mine. "You are making a scene. You are embarrassing your brother. I am going to have security drag you out of here by your hair if you do not walk out that door right now." I turned my head very slowly and locked eyes with my father. "Remove your hand from my chair, Dad," I said softly, the absolute zero temperature of my voice freezing him in place. "Or I will have Julian call the police and have you arrested for assault before the appetizer is served. Do not test me tonight. You do not have the capital to survive it." Calvin swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He instinctively let go of the chair, taking a half-step back, but he was too desperate to give up. He turned his attention to Chloe's parents, sitting directly across from me. Mr. and Mrs. Davenport looked entirely bewildered. The elegant Boston lawyers had spent the evening being charmed by a wealthy Southern patriarch and were now watching that same patriarch threaten to physically drag a woman out of a fine dining establishment. "Please accept my deepest apologies, Richard," Calvin said, addressing Chloe's father with a forced, trembling smile. "This is my estranged daughter, Simone. She struggles with severe mental health issues. She has been having an episode all week and unfortunately she tracked us down here. We are trying to get her the professional help she needs, but she refuses treatment. I will handle this quietly so we can get back to our celebration." The audacity of the lie was breathtaking. He was weaponizing the concept of mental illness to discredit me, protecting his financial facade at the cost of my entire reputation. He reached for my upper arm, intending to physically pull me out of the seat, But before his fingers could even brush the velvet sleeve of my jacket, a new voice cut through the tension. Do not touch her. The command did not come from me. It came from the other end of the table. Chloe Davenport stood up. She did not look like the terrified junior executive who had sat in my office yesterday morning. She looked like a woman who had spent the last 36 hours processing a massive betrayal and had finally arrived at absolute clarity. She stood tall, her shoulders pulled back, her gaze locked dead onto my brother. No, Jamal, she said, her voice ringing out crisp and clear across the crystalline roses. Let her stay. In fact, I invited her. The entire room seemed to experience a collective drop in barometric pressure. Jamal's jaw actually fell open. He looked from Chloe to me and back to Chloe, his brain entirely failing to process the betrayal. My mother Brenda let out a small, horrified gasp, pressing her napkin against her mouth. Chloe, what are you talking about? Jamal stammered, taking a step back toward her. Honey, she is manipulating you. She is sick. She came to your office yesterday to mess with your head, because she is jealous of what we have. Please, just sit down and let my father handle her. Do not talk to me like I am a child, Jamal. Chloe snapped, her voice hardening into steel. She did not come to my office. I went to hers. Because after your father made an absolute fool of himself in the lobby of the Apex Acquisitions Tower, I needed to know exactly who I was working for. And more importantly, I needed to know who I was marrying. Mr. Davenport stood up now, his lawyer instincts kicking into high gear. He adjusted his suit jacket, looking sharply at Jamal and Calvin. Chloe, what is going on here? He demanded in a deep, authoritative tone. Who is this woman and why is Calvin saying she is unwell? She is not unwell, Dad, Chloe said, looking directly at her father. She is Simone Thomas. She is the chief executive officer of the company that just bought my firm. She is the owner of the building I work in. And she is the only person in this room who has told me the truth since I moved to Atlanta. Calvin began to shake. Actual, visible tremors ran down his arms. He looked at me with a pleading, desperate expression, silently begging me to keep his secrets. The man who had spent 35 years making me the scapegoat of the family, the man who had stolen my tuition money and barred me from this very dinner, was now entirely at my mercy. I did not offer him a single ounce of grace. I reached into my sleek leather designer bag resting by my feet. I pulled out the thick, heavy manila folder. I did not rush. I let the anticipation stretch, allowing the Davenports to realize that whatever I was holding was about to fundamentally alter their daughter's life. I placed the folder flat against the crisp white tablecloth, and with a single smooth motion, I slid it directly down the center of the table. It glided past the crystal water goblets, past the imported orchids, stopping perfectly between Jamal and Chloe. Jamal stared at the cardboard folder as if it were a ticking bomb. Go ahead, Jamal, I said, my voice carrying effortlessly to every corner of the silent room. Open it. Show your future in-laws the generational wealth you were just giving a speech about. Show them the Thomas family trust. Show them exactly how you are paying for this private room tonight. Jamal did not move. He was entirely paralyzed. Chloe reached out and flipped the folder open. The heavy cardstock cover fell back, revealing the stack of financial forensic documents my investigator had compiled. The very first page, resting on the crisp white tablecloth, was the official notice of default from First Piedmont Alliance. It was printed on stark, formal letterhead, the bold black ink outlining the exact parameters of my father's financial ruin. Chloe stared at the page. Her eyes tracked across the massive principal balance and the glaring red stamp indicating the account was 90 days delinquent. She did not say a word. She simply slid the piece of paper down the table toward her father. Richard Davenport was a senior partner at a prestigious Boston law firm. He spent his entire life analyzing contracts, mitigating corporate risks, and destroying people who committed fraud. He picked up the document and reached into his breast pocket, pulling out a pair of silver reading glasses. He placed them on his face and read the first paragraph. The silence in the Bordeaux room was so absolute, you could hear the soft hum of the expensive climate control system. My mother Brenda was gripping her napkin so tightly, her knuckles were completely white. Jamal stood frozen at the head of the table, staring at the folder like it was a venomous snake preparing to strike. Richard lowered the paper and looked directly at my father. "Calvin," he said, his voice completely stripped of the warm familial tone he had been using just 5 minutes ago. "This is a formal notice of default and intent to foreclose on a residential property. It indicates you took out a $400,000 second mortgage 10 months ago and have ceased making payments." My father immediately began to sweat profusely. He wiped his forehead with the back of his trembling hand, trying to summon the charismatic patriarch persona, but his voice cracked terribly. "Richard, there is a perfectly reasonable explanation for that," Calvin stammered, taking a step toward the Davenports. "It is a simple banking error, a miscommunication with my wealth management team. You know how these large financial institutions operate. They automate these notices by mistake all the time. I will have my accountant clear it up first thing on Monday morning." I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table. "It is not a banking error, Dad," I said, my voice slicing through his pathetic excuse with quiet surgical precision. "You mortgaged the house my grandfather paid for, so you could hand the cash directly to Jamal. You traded the only real asset this family had to pay for premium floral arrangements and a rented tuxedo." Jamal flinched as if I had physically struck him. "Shut up, Simone," he hissed, his eyes darting frantically toward Chloe. "She is lying, Chloe. She fabricated these documents because she is obsessed with destroying my happiness." Chloe did not look at him. She reached into the folder and pulled out the second stack of papers. She bypassed her father entirely and read the numbers aloud herself. "Jamal Thomas." She read, her voice remarkably steady, despite the complete destruction of her future. 7 premium credit cards entirely maxed out. 3 unsecured personal loans from high-risk lenders. An auto loan that is currently in the repossession pipeline. She dropped the papers back onto the table and looked up at the man she was supposed to marry. "You are carrying over $200,000 in toxic consumer debt." Jamal swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw ticking erratically. "Baby, that is just business leverage," he pleaded, taking a step toward her with his hands raised in surrender. "You do not understand how venture consulting works. You have to spend money to make money. I am waiting on several massive contracts to close next quarter. That debt is completely strategic." "Strategic," I repeated, allowing a cold smile to touch the corners of my mouth. I did not realize buying a gold Rolex on a credit card charging 24% interest was a strategic corporate investment. I did not know that taking a cash advance to pay your monthly country club dues was standard venture capital behavior. Mrs. Davenport, who had remained quiet until now, let out a soft sound of absolute disgust. She looked at Jamal as if he were a cockroach that had just crawled out from under the expensive silver cutlery. "He is a fraud, Richard," Mrs. Davenport said, turning to her husband. "We are sitting in a room with complete frauds." My mother, Brenda, finally broke her silence. She slammed her hands down on the table, tears streaming down her face. "How can you do this, Simone?" she cried, her voice thick with misplaced righteous anger. "How can you come in here and humiliate your own flesh and blood in front of strangers? Your father did what he had to do to give your brother a good life. We made sacrifices. You did make sacrifices, Mom." I agreed, keeping my gaze locked on her weeping face. "But you did not sacrifice your own future. You sacrificed mine." I looked at Chloe and nodded toward the folder. "Turn to the last page," I instructed softly. Chloe flipped past the credit reports and pulled out a faded photocopy of an old bank transfer authorization. It was a document from 15 years ago, but the ink was still legible. My grandfather Theodore was a hard-working man. I told the room, my voice dropping into a register of heavy, inescapable truth. He did not leave behind a sprawling real estate empire. He left behind a single life insurance policy worth $50,000. And he left it in a trust entirely in my name, specifically designated for my college tuition. Richard Davenport leaned forward, his lawyer instincts sensing the legal violation before I even finished the sentence. When I was 18, my father forged my signature on a release document. I continued pointing at the paper Chloe was holding. He drained my entire educational fund in a single afternoon. He stole the money my grandfather left me, and he used it to buy Jamal a brand new luxury sports car so Jamal could impress his college fraternity brothers. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before it. Chloe stared at the forged signature. Richard took the paper from his daughter and examined the dates, his face hardening into a mask of pure professional fury. "You committed wire fraud and theft of a fiduciary account," Richard stated, looking at my father with lethal, absolute clarity. "You stole from your own daughter to buy a car." Calvin backed away from the table, his hands raised defensively. "I was the legal custodian of that account," he argued weakly, his voice trembling with terror. "I made a financial decision for the benefit of the entire family. Simone was not taking her studies seriously. Jamal had a real future. I was investing in my son. I quit school because the tuition check bounced, Dad." I replied, the memory no longer carrying the sting of rejection, but the cold, hard weight of victory. "I spent the next decade working 80-hour weeks building Apex acquisitions from the ground up, while you and Mom coddled a man who has never worked a real day in his life. You spent 35 years telling me I was a failure because I did not fit your aesthetic. You told me I was the black sheep." I stood up from my chair, slowly smoothing the front of my velvet suit. I looked at the extravagant floral centerpieces and the crystal champagne flutes. "But the truth is, you were just terrified of me, because I was the only person in this family who refused to participate in your delusions." Chloe Davenport stood up. She did not look at my father or my mother. She looked exclusively at Jamal. Jamal took a step toward her, his eyes wide with desperate panic. "Chloe, please," he begged, reaching his hand out across the table. "We can fix this. I love you. We are building a legacy together. Once we get married, we can restructure the debt." Chloe looked down at her left hand. She reached over and grasped the massive diamond engagement ring resting on her finger. It was a beautiful stone, likely purchased with the exact same toxic loans that were currently suffocating my father. She pulled the ring off her finger. The sound of the heavy platinum and diamond jewelry hitting the manila folder was a sharp metallic clatter that echoed through the private dining room. "There is no legacy, Jamal," Chloe said, her voice completely devoid of tears or hesitation. "You are not a millionaire. You are a parasite, and this wedding is officially canceled." She turned to her parents. "Mom, Dad, I am ready to leave now." Richard Davenport immediately stood up, followed by his wife. He did not say another word to my father or my brother. He simply buttoned his suit jacket and placed a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder, guiding her away from the table. The three of them walked toward the heavy oak doors without looking back, leaving the shattered remains of Jamal's fake empire scattered across the white linen. As the doors clicked shut behind the Davenports, the illusion finally completely broke. Jamal let out a guttural scream of absolute rage. He turned on my father instantly, all the respect and loyalty of the golden child evaporating in the face of his own destruction. "You promised me you had this handled," Jamal shouted, grabbing his father by the lapels of his rented tuxedo. "You said the house was fine. You said the money was secure. You ruined my life. You drove her away." Calvin shoved his son backward, his own panic turning into defensive fury. "I gave you everything I had, you ungrateful brat," Calvin roared, the veins in his neck bulging against his collar. "I mortgaged my entire life to pay for your suits and your cars and this stupid wedding." Brenda was sobbing hysterically now, covering her face with her hands, begging them both to stop shouting. It was a pathetic, miserable display of a toxic family finally consuming itself. My father suddenly turned away from Jamal and looked at me. The rage in his eyes flickered and died, replaced by the absolute rock-bottom desperation of a man who realized he had absolutely nothing left. He fell to his knees right there on the polished hardwood floor of the exclusive French restaurant. He crawled forward slightly, the knees of his tuxedo pants sliding against the wood. "Simone, please." Calvin begged, tears finally spilling down his cheeks. He abandoned every single ounce of his pride in front of the empty chairs and the spilled champagne. "You have to help me. You are the chief executive officer. You have millions of dollars. The bank is going to take the house, Simone. Your mother and I will be out on the street. Please just wire the money. Pay off the bank. I will do whatever you want. I will apologize for everything. Just pay off the debt." I looked down at the man kneeling on the floor. I looked at the man who had physically blocked me from entering a country club just 6 days ago because I embarrassed him. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the scent of the roasted truffles and the expensive wine fill my lungs. "I did pay it off, Dad," I said, my voice quiet and absolute. Calvin froze, looking up at me with sudden, desperate hope. What he whispered, his eyes wide. "I instructed my legal team to purchase a bulk portfolio of distressed residential debt from First Piedmont Alliance yesterday morning," I explained, casually adjusting the strap of my leather bag on my shoulder. "Your second mortgage was included in that tranche. The wire transfers cleared. The deed of trust was officially reassigned." Calvin stared at me completely, unable to process the legal terminology through the haze of his panic. He shook his head slowly. "What does that mean, Simone?" "It means I am the bank, Dad." I delivered the killing blow, my voice echoing with brutal finality. "I own the debt, which means I am your landlord, and since you are severely in violation of the original lending agreement, I have accelerated the loan. You have 30 days to vacate my property." My father collapsed forward, resting his hands flat against the floor as a terrible wailing sob ripped its way out of his throat. He had spent his entire life building a kingdom of lies, and he was finally being evicted from his own castle. Jamal stood entirely motionless, staring at me as if I were a ghost. The golden child had finally realized that the sister he spent his whole life looking down on was the one holding the deed to his entire existence. I turned and walked toward the exit. I paused just before I reached the heavy oak doors, looking back over my shoulder at the sprawling banquet table, the uneaten gourmet food, the imported floral arrangements, the vintage champagne chilling in silver buckets. It was a masterpiece of financial ruin. "Enjoy the dinner," I said, offering my brother one final cold smile. "And Jamal, since you are the one who booked the private room, the bill is entirely yours. I suggest you figure out which credit card has not been declined yet." I pushed the doors open and walked out into the warm ambient light of the hallway. I did not look back as the sounds of my mother's hysterical crying and my father's broken sobbing faded behind the heavy wood. I walked past the host stand, offering Julian a polite nod of thanks, and stepped out into the crisp autumn night. My chauffeured Maybach was waiting at the curb. I slid into the quiet leather interior, leaving the chaos and the lies exactly where they belonged, entirely in my past. Exactly 30 days later, the legal machinery of Apex Acquisitions completed its work with absolute emotionless efficiency. The foreclosure process, which my father had so arrogantly dismissed as a banking error, was finalized. The eviction notice was executed without a single delay. Calvin and Brenda were forced to pack up 30 years of accumulated memories and fabricated status symbols. They had to leave behind the sprawling brick home with the manicured lawn and the heated pool. Because my father had completely decimated his credit score to fund his son's fake lifestyle, they could not secure a lease in any of the affluent neighborhoods they used to look down upon. They were forced to downsize into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. There were no country club memberships anymore. There were no rented designer tuxedos. Their new reality consisted of thin walls, linoleum floors, and the heavy, suffocating weight of living strictly within their actual means. My father's booming, charismatic voice was permanently silenced by the sheer humiliation of his new zip code. He refused to leave the apartment out of fear that he might run into one of his old society friends. Jamal's descent was even faster and far more brutal. Without Chloe's executive salary to underwrite his delusions, and with his father completely cut off from the equity of the house, the golden child was left to face his financial ruin entirely alone. The high-risk creditors he had borrowed from stopped being polite. Less than a week after the rehearsal dinner, his luxury German sports car was repossessed in the middle of the night right out of the apartment parking lot. With over $200,000 in toxic debt, demanding immediate minimum payments, Jamal could no longer pretend to be a venture capital consultant. He was forced to take the very first job that would hire him without a completed graduate degree or a verified resume. The man who had once stood on the marble steps of an exclusive venue looking down at me for having little hustles now spends his days wearing a stiff polyester uniform. He works the customer service return desk at a massive big-box electronics store. He spends 40 hours a week standing under buzzing fluorescent lights, getting yelled at by angry customers over broken televisions, just so he can afford to pay the interest on the credit cards he used to buy his designer watches. I saw Chloe only once during that month. We crossed paths in the main lobby of the corporate tower. She looked vibrant, rested, and entirely unburdened. She did not look away when she saw me. Instead, she walked directly over and offered me a warm, genuine smile of profound gratitude. She had dodged a financial bullet that would have ruined her life, and she was currently thriving in her new role at my company. It seemed the dust had finally settled until a Tuesday afternoon when my private executive line rang. David, my assistant, had been rigorously filtering my calls, but the incoming number belonged to a local dry cleaning business. Assuming it was a vendor issue, David routed it through. When I picked up the receiver, I did not hear a vendor. I heard the frantic, breathless sobbing of my mother. "Simone, please do not hang up!" Brenda cried, her voice echoing with a desperate, pathetic urgency. I had to borrow the phone from the manager down the street. "Your father will not let me call you, but I had to hear your voice." I leaned back in my leather chair, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Atlanta skyline. I did not feel a spike of adrenaline. I felt absolutely nothing. "Yes, Mom," I answered, keeping my tone flat and professional. "We have nothing." "Simone," she wept, the tears practically dripping through the receiver. "This apartment is so small. Your father is depressed and Jamal will not even speak to us anymore. He blames us for losing Chloe. Please, Simone, you proved your point. You showed everyone how powerful you are. But we are your family. We are your blood. Can you not just give us a second chance? Can you not just help us get a small house so we can be a family again?" The manipulation was so deeply ingrained in her that she could not even hear it. She was not calling to apologize for watching my father physically bar me from a building. She was not calling to apologize for the stolen tuition money. She was calling because she was uncomfortable and she wanted the daughter she had discarded to write her a check. "Mom," I said, my voice carrying the quiet, absolute chill of a winter storm. "You do not want a daughter. You want a sponsor. You stood by and watched Calvin steal my future to buy Jamal's affection. You told me I was ruining the night when I was literally walking away from abuse. We made mistakes," she sobbed loudly, trying to interrupt me. "But you have to forgive us. I do not have to do anything," I corrected her smoothly. "The only mistake you made was assuming I would always be the scapegoat willing to absorb your toxic behavior. You chose your golden child. You chose the illusion. Now you have to live inside it. Do not ever call this number again." I placed the receiver down gently, severing the connection forever. I instructed David to block the dry cleaner's number and returned my attention to the quarterly financial projections glowing on my monitor. I sat in my high-rise office, surrounded by the silent, secure empire I had built with my own two hands. For years I had agonized over why I was never good enough for them. I had internalized their rejection, believing there was something fundamentally wrong with me. But looking back at the absolute wreckage of their lives, I finally understood the truth. Their rejection was never a punishment. It was the universe providing absolute protection. Being the family outcast meant I was never tethered to their sinking ship. Being banished from their tables forced me to go out and build my own. They spent my whole life trying to keep me out of their rooms, not realizing I was busy building my own castle. The greatest lesson I learned is that sharing DNA does not excuse toxic behavior. For years, I believed that achieving more would finally earn my family's respect. However, true self-worth is never found in the validation of people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Sometimes the most empowering decision you can make is walking away from a table where you are constantly devalued. Rejection is often just the universe protecting your peace and redirecting you toward your actual purpose. You do not need their permission or approval to build your own castle. If you have ever had to set hard boundaries with toxic family members to protect your peace, hit the like button, subscribe, and share your journey in the comments below.